accountability is gone. There's no sense of accountability. Washington is an unaccountable city. You can fail catastrophically. The people who brought us the the failures of Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, they're being promoted, or they were being promoted during the Biden-Harris presidency. Victoria Nuland, she was involved in the Iraq and Afghanistan catastrophes, and she was promoted. She then produced the Ukraine catastrophe, which killed hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians for nothing, because they're going to lose the war anyway, no matter what the U.S. does. It's basically an unaccountable city.
Let's now move to the second part of this discussion about this newfound reason to exist for NATO, for the neocons themselves, and that's humanitarian interventions. That's like the dressing up of war in the garment of peace and bringing peace. And Jens Stoltenberg gave us this sentence 2 years ago: "Weapons are, in fact, the way to peace." Your book that you wrote, this wonderful work on first do no harm, humanitarian intervention and the destruction of Yugoslavia. You trace this back to the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s, and Yugoslavia is highly fascinating to me because it was a non-aligned state. It was not a primary adversary of the United States, but one of the things about neutrality, which I study, is that neutrals are always a secondary target of belligerents because the neutrals also don't do what you want them to do. Was there a policy, or was there something in the United States that helped the war in Yugoslavia to, well, help the war? I mean, got it going to where it went?
Yes, it was the breakup of Yugoslavia, I'd say, was made possible by a number of things, but one of the key factors, the sine qua non, was foreign support for the breakup of Yugoslavia. Actually, it's not beginning the United States, believe it or not, briefly Germany played the key role, and that German officials spoke privately to Slovenia and Croatia, which Yugoslavia was a very loose federation, basically a confederation, and these regional disparities. Croatia and Slovenia were the richest republics, and they wanted to cede, I would say, mostly because they didn't want to subsidize the poor republics. This, I should add, a context also was neoliberalism. They underwent a terrible debt crisis and austerity imposed by the IMF in the 1980s. And one thing we do know about ethnic conflict and about, dysfunctional politics is it often takes place in the context of economic crisis. For all the talk about Hitler and the Third Reich, people forget it was the Great Depression that brought Hitler more than any other factor. People always leave that out, at least these days. And Yugoslavia had its own Great Depression in the 1980s, which is what set the context for ethnic conflict. But I think it would not have broken up had it not been for external support for breaking it up. And what reason for that is anti-communism. Yugoslavia was a communist state. Despite the 1980s, most of its history was quite successful, including economically. Communism was very popular in Yugoslavia, and they wanted to basically ensure that with the end of the Cold War, communism would be finished once and for all, including even countries in which it was fairly successful, like Yugoslavia. And so, breaking up Yugoslavia, this is very much in the German press. That it was being discussed that one of the purposes of here is to put an end to communism once and for all. And breaking up Yugoslavia is part of that agenda, so Germany played the lead role briefly, and I emphasize briefly. The U.S. was distracted, but the U.S. quickly took charge of the situation. And I think the United States initially viewed Yugoslavia as a parochial European issue. The U.S. was focused on more important things, such as managing Russia, the former Soviet Union, and more importantly, the Persian Gulf and the Middle East. These little issues, as we saw it at the time, namely the Balkans, the Europeans could handle that. But that was briefly. And very quickly, the U.S. realized that the U.S. could use, there were two competing agendas here. The Europeans were thinking of having an independent foreign policy and wanted to demonstrate their capacity to act as a collective power. And the way they were going to do that is, despite the brief German foray into unilateralism, they are going to collectively send a mission to broker a peace agreement in what was seen as the most dangerous of all of the former republics, which was Bosnia-Herzegovina, where there are three ethnic groups who were probably going to go at each other's throats and tear each other apart, which of course they did, with enormous loss of life, especially civilian life. More the Serbs, because they were better armed, but all three groups engaged in terrible atrocities. And the European plan was in 1992 to come up with a peace plan that would settle the conflict before war began. Yugoslavia had already broken up, but now Bosnia-Herzegovina was threatened with breakup, violent breakup. And the idea was to prevent violence and come up with a plan for a decentralization of Bosnia along ethnic lines to satisfy all three ethnic groups, to make sure all three ethnic groups weren't threatened by each other. And the three different ethnic groups, they met in Lisbon under the tutelage of the Portuguese diplomat acting at behest of the EU named Coutinho, José Coutinho. And there was an in-principle agreement that almost succeeded. All three ethnic groups had, in principle, agreed to most of it. There were still details to be ironed out, but it was looking positive. And the US ambassador contacted the Croatian and Muslim leaders and said, in effect, you don't have to sign this if you don't want to. Maybe you can get a better deal, with the implication the US would arm them if there were a war. I don't think he explicitly offered arms, but he did imply the United States would support them if they wanted to fall off the deal. And the deal broke down right after that. And then and then a 2.5-year vicious war began with about 100,000 deaths, large numbers of civilians, cities destroyed, lives ruined. Again, more from the Serb side because they had more weapons, but from all three sides to some degree. And throughout the entire process, the EU and also the United Nations sent negotiators. The key figure here was David Owen, the former foreign minister of Great Britain. Also, ironically enough, Stoltenberg's father from, I think he was foreign minister of Norway, if I believe, or was he prime minister, was involved in this as well. And the idea was to revive what in essence had been agreed to at Lisbon and settle the war again on the basis more or less of what had been agreed to on the Lisbon basis. And David Owen said in his memoirs, the main stumbling block, the main thing that prevented us from getting an agreement was the US refused to cooperate. And so I think this was the neocon idea here, that the United States would settle this through military force. They would get NATO involved, so NATO would get a justification. It didn't have a justification. Now it would have a justification. It would win a war. It would defeat ethnic cleansing. And so NATO finally, the US began arming the various sides covertly. They began arranging for arms to come in from Iran. Ironically, they used Iran to help supply weapons to the Muslim faction. And the US arranged for arms shipments to both the Croats and the Muslims. And they became America's ground forces. And then the US began a massive bombing campaign against the Serbs, and the combination of the NATO bombing campaign and the US support for the ground forces established something like a military victory. And then the United States began a peace negotiation at Dayton Air Force Base in Ohio. Significantly, it was at Dayton Air Force Base, an American Air Force Base, and surrounded by bombers and things like that. It was a nice symbol of American military power, which was the whole idea, was to showcase American military power here. And then they ironed out an agreement remarkably similar to what the Europeans had been proposing for 2.5 years and the US had rejected. And so if one wants to be a cynic, as I am, the whole purpose of this was to ensure that the United States and NATO got credit for this, and Europe did not get credit for it, because the whole idea was to ensure Europe did not establish itself as an independent actor in foreign policy and to bury the idea of an independent Europe. And so that was one of the main considerations here. It gave a new prestige to NATO. American officials in memoirs said it was the victory in Bosnia that gave so much credibility to NATO that we could begin thinking about a forward policy of expanding NATO into Eastern Europe, which was the real agenda. And so it solved several problems. One, it gave a new justification for NATO. Two, it gave a justification for expanding NATO into Eastern Europe. And three, and this is critical, it gave a new justification for military spending. You see, the expectation was as countries expand, become members of NATO, Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary all joined in 1999, I believe, followed by other countries. They would get rid of their former Soviet equipment and buy US and Western European equipment to replace it. This was something the military-industrial complex had always wanted and had been lobbying for that. And some of the main backers of NATO expansion were military contractors because they wanted those contracts. And so the NATO victory and US victory in Bosnia solved multiple problems, though at very high expense because 100,000 people died, didn't have to die. And so the idea was you disparage negotiations as signs of weakness. You only do negotiations after you achieve a military victory, as putting a cap on the military victory.
And this Yugoslavia is still a linchpin, a key of the way that Europeans think about war and peace, because there's especially the massacre of Srebrenica that burned itself into, or was burned into the consciousness, especially of a lot of Germans,
Yeah.
and that then now even today is being used. And Srebrenica happened in 95. Right? 1995. And it was a bad massacre. It was like tens of thousands of people died at the hands of the Serb army.
8,000, I think. 8,000, I think, is the number.
8,000, not 10,000.
8,000.
8,000. But,
They were military age, mostly military-aged males, but they were disarmed and they were executed, yes.
They disarmed, they were confined, and then they were executed
right.
over the course of 3 days. And that was obviously a horrible incident. But a lot of Germans today keep saying, never Srebrenica again. We will never ever allow again for our love for peace and for negotiation to overwrite a military objective, which is to save lives for humanitarian intervention. Now that justifies a lot, and I had a German historian yell at me when I said like we should not arm the Ukrainians with more weapons because he said like you are going to justify another Srebrenica. So this is psychologically very important. Can you speak to that a bit?
Most of what they say is correct, except when they get to the point of military intervention. Military intervention made it worse, didn't make it better. This whole war could have been avoided if the agreement agreed to at Dayton had been agreed to at Lisbon. They could have avoided the war if they'd done that, but the US kept blocking this. They said that the war isn't good enough for the Bosnians, for the Muslim Bosnians, whereas what they got at Dayton was very similar. In fact, you could say they got even less at Dayton. So basically, rather than going to war, there should have been negotiations. Negotiations could have prevented the war. It could have stopped it before Srebrenica. And so the whole idea here is you don't do negotiations with evil people like Slobodan Milosevic or Radovan Karadzic or any of these other people and they were certainly Radovan Karadzic in particular was very bad. Milosevic was also a very cynical actor. There's no doubt about this. The problem, though, is that because we didn't want to negotiate with them for years and only did it after military victory, 100,000 people had to die, including 8,000 at Srebrenica. It would have been better to have negotiated earlier and prevented this than to have allowed it to happen. And so I think what Yugoslavia did and Srebrenica in particular did is enshrine the political left had been anti-interventionist during the Cold War. There was a very neat divide. I remember this very well growing up, going to college. Anti-interventionism, anti-militarism, that was the left took that view. And the right were the opposite. And it was a nice, neat divide when the world was simpler. And I think Yugoslavia changed the idea. And the idea then became many people on the left said, no, we need more military force to do good, to protect people from massacres. There was a lot of very simplistic ideas that, what you had here is cartoon character bad guys and victims, and it was that simple. Always compared to Hitler, of course. It's always World War II. Always, always, always. There's no other precedent they can think of other than World War II. No other evil person they can think of other than Hitler. And this became very attractive on the left. Also, identity politics came into it. Women were being abused. They were being raped by the Serb forces. There's no doubt that happened. And that was a terrible thing. Of course, it was a terrible thing. But the idea was use military force to prevent this. Later on, they would add gay rights. So you need to use military force to protect gay rights. military force is a terrible way to protect women, gays, and anyone else, children. It gets these people killed, is what it does. It killed 100,000 people in Bosnia-Herzegovina. It would have been far better to emphasize negotiation rather than military force. And so I don't know why these people keep saying that we should have used military force earlier. We should have negotiated earlier. That was a real option. There's definitely evidence a negotiated solution was possible. It was blocked by those who said, no, don't negotiate, use force instead.
Yeah, but we know that there is certain actors who 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 have no moral qualms to lie, outright lies, in the name of then implementing humanitarian ideals. There's a very, very good German language documentary called "It Began with a Lie" that even aired in 2007 in German mainstream public on a public broadcaster. 2007 about 1999 and how the entire Kosovo war,
Yeah.
basically the Kosovo bombing campaign, started with the idea that the Serbs are now executing people on a football field in Pristina, in the capital of Kosovo. And it was known at the time it was a lie. It was as known a lie as the weapons of mass destruction for Iraq. And still, it was such a convenient talking point to justify another bombing campaign, and there off they went. And the Germans participated, of course. I mean, that was Germany's re-entrance into the foray, the world of bombing campaigns.
That's right. It did produce a sea change, even in Germany more than anywhere else. And the Green Party, and people forget this, the Green Party
Yeah.
came out of environmentalism and a certain pacifism. They became anti-pacifist. They became one of the most warlike parties in Europe, what they are today. And it was the Yugoslav wars that changed them. And I think the whole idea of humanitarian intervention was extremely effective. It was indeed, the neocons' secret weapon. And it converted the left on both sides of the Atlantic to being pro-war for the most part. And I'm very struck by this, how after 1990, increasingly anti-war moved to the right. If you look at antiwar.com, which I read every day, I've published on it, it's both leftists and libertarians, mostly libertarians. If you read The American Conservative, that's some of the best anti-war commentary you'll find. A lot of the anti-war one of the anti-war think tanks is the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian think tank, heavily corporate funded, I'm sorry to say. I personally prefer the old days when you need divide, when right was right and left was left, but those days are gone. And you're getting the left has mostly become pro-war.
Yeah.
And that really has changed dramatically.
And it has been co-opted like intellectually.
Yeah.
And we have a lot of very even also historians and politicians who used to be very strong anti-war figures, who even now, especially in the Ukraine war, really,
Yeah,
really
that's
bought
right.
the idea. Not only bought, but they're going to defend it with their teeth. That this time weapons are the way to peace, and it happened there in the 90s. And the Greens, especially,
Yeah.
are very interesting. There's another book in German called like "Never Again," about the Green Party and war, and it starts with "never again" and then the addition in brackets "without us." So only we are going to be part of war coalitions from now on, which they are since the late 90s. Um,
Can I just point out, you have to look at the record. In other words, people who say these flowery phrases like what you just said, you have to look at the record here. Yugoslavia, the record was war rather than negotiation led to 100,000 deaths in Bosnia, including the Srebrenica massacre. Kosovo was a low-level war. Only 2,000 people had died on both sides up till the NATO bombing. And the NATO bombing hugely expanded, tremendously expanded the scale of atrocities and death. It didn't have to happen that way. That too could have been negotiated with an end to the war without bombing, but they opted not to do that. You had the Second Gulf War. That was a humanitarian war to free the Iraqi people from the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein. We all know how that went. Maybe killed up to 1 million Iraqis who didn't have to die. The Afghanistan war was to free the women of Afghanistan from the Taliban. We had 20 years of war almost, and the Taliban are now back in power. We had the overthrow of Gaddafi, again, who was massacring his own people. He was a terrible dictator, and so on and so forth. And it destabilized the whole of North Africa. It made the situation much worse than before. If we do regime change, people talk sometimes about regime change in North Korea. If God forbid that happens, we'll probably have the biggest humanitarian catastrophe since 1945, but it'll be justified in humanitarian terms. And so the record, the rhetoric and the record could not be further apart, in that you have this humanitarian altruistic record and, rhetoric and a record of action that is the opposite of altruistic. It's catastrophic from the standpoint of human rights.
How do you explain to yourself, and I know you're a historian, not a psychologist, but how do you explain to yourself that even with such a clear track record, really clear, and especially also when it comes to the lies to justify the wars, and we can go to the Gulf of Tonkin, but we can go to the Yugoslav wars, we can go to the Iraq war, and the millions of people, and Afghanistan. How do you explain to yourself that this still doesn't change at least the mindset of the classic left, the ones who went out of pacifism and got into militarism? Why do they still stick there? What is it that keeps him?
I don't have a good explanation, but I do note just a fact, which is this is an unaccountable error. Accountability is gone. There's no sense of accountability. Washington is an unaccountable city. You can fail catastrophically. The people who brought us the failures of Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, they're being promoted, or they were being promoted during the Biden-Harris presidency. Victoria Nuland, she was involved in the Iraq and Afghanistan catastrophes, and she was promoted. She then produced the Ukraine catastrophe, which killed hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians for nothing, because they're going to lose the war anyway, no matter what the U.S. does. It's basically an unaccountable city, Washington. And the left has become unaccountable too. They bought into this unaccountability. I do note a culture change here, which is after Vietnam, there was accountability. The men who brought us the war, and they were all men in those days, they were discredited, and their careers were damaged or destroyed, and rightly so. Many of them publicly apologized and expressed deep regret. Robert McNamara, for example, the former Secretary of Defense, publicly expressed great regret. The Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, he couldn't find a job after he left the State Department. Nobody would hire him. So there was accountability back then, but something in the culture changed, that we never learn from past failures, and we never hold people accountable for those failures. And that's just as true on the left as it is in the establishment. Why that's so, you'll have to get a psychologist to explain that.
But that is the crux, and not just on a psychological level, because the matter of the fact is we have a system that produces violence and keeps itself alive. Now, if the system was self-correcting and violence would die down because you have accountability, then we wouldn't have the violent system we have. But if we have a system that produces violence, and the violence is then even the failures are excused, you keep it perpetually alive, right? So what is it that makes it possible? Is it the military-industrial complex that then just takes these people in, gives them jobs, and makes sure that they're fine? Is it also the fact that maybe the US never really lost a war, at least not the United States? The only part of North America that really lost a war is the Confederacy, right? But the rest never really lost the way that South Vietnam lost the Vietnam War, right?
Or Germany, right? 1945. That's right, yeah. Well, I suppose that's true. Nevertheless, we do have it is a fact that after Vietnam, we did learn from our mistakes, at least for a few years. And we did correct for them up to a point. And as I said, there was discrediting of people who had manifestly failed. And there's a whole book written on it, The Best and the Brightest by David Halberstam. It was about, the fact that basically these very bright people had failed catastrophically. And that was the basic perspective. That everybody seemed to accept that fact. Whereas now nobody does. I'll just give you, what would accountability look like? I'll give you one example. On the right, there's someone named Walter Jones, who was a very right-wing congressman. He's died now, who was one of the most enthusiastic supporters of the Iraq War, so much so that when France opposed the war at the United Nations, he put a bill into Congress that passed that declared that in the House of Representatives cafeteria, we would no longer refer to French fries, we'd call them freedom fries. And French toast became freedom toast. Yeah, people ridiculed him, and rightly so. But he was a very pro-war figure. He came to very deeply regret his support for the war and publicly apologized. He was a Christian. He's very sort of hyper-religious figure. And I think he said things like, may God forgive me for having supported this war. And for the rest of his life, he spent every day writing letters, individual letters, to families of American soldiers who died in Iraq or Afghanistan. And by all indications, he was kind of almost doing penance for having supported the war. And what again, I don't share his religious views and his politics, but I do appreciate the accountability. He was accountable. And that's what accountability looks like. And he's virtually the only one who did that. And I marvel at that fact that there was simply almost no accountability after failure.
Yeah, and the rest of these people, often when the failure happens, what they do and what you hear publicly, especially also from people like Blinken and so on, is we should have done more of the thing that failed that would have gotten us the victory in the end. So they then start blaming not
Yeah.
doing enough of the bombing and the interventionisms, right? That's especially in the media about the Ukraine wars. What we hear constantly: had we just given more weapons at the beginning, then the Russians would have been beaten.
I'm sure that'll be the that'll be the justification that the United States and Europe weren't aggressive enough right off the bat, and had we done that, all would have gone well. People said the same thing about Vietnam. I mean, that's always true in wars. It's like the stab in the back theory. They were cowards who stabbed us in the back. I don't know what to say about that, except that the main thing we should learn from the Ukraine war is that all of this could have been settled through diplomacy. And Russia offered to settle it through diplomacy, and the U.S. flat out rejected that. And the people who have paid the price for that have been the Ukrainians. I do think a time will come when the Ukrainians will deeply resent how they've been used by the United States. Even if that time hasn't come yet, I'm sure it will come.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure about that too. But let's maybe talk a little bit about how to handle this situation, but not from the viewpoint of the US or the Europeans, which to me are so deeply embedded in their own ideology that I don't see how we get out of this in any time soon. But in a multipolar world, we have other actors. We have the Russians, we have the Chinese, we have the global South, we have a lot of countries in the BRICS who are all now looking at Europe and the US, and some people watch this channel. What would be your recommendation? Or no, not that. Where is the idea of humanitarian intervention and this whole aggressive foreign policy today, and how should other actors in the international scene deal with the fact that there is such an ideological pro-interventionist foreign policy around among one of the great players?
I do see the emergence of the BRICS as a very positive development internationally. As I would see it, basically, you have had a gradual decline of US hegemony, which was inevitable given the rise of China. These two wars in the Middle East and Ukraine have accelerated that decline, and the BRICS is the expression of that. There's one more point I do want to note. I think that it's often left out in these discussions, which is public opinion in the United States and Europe. The public in Vietnam, there were a number of things that ended the war, but one of them is the public reared its ugly head, and it objected to the war. Objected to the fact that the war was endlessly being fought. Americans were being killed. It was affecting the economy. And there was public insistence that it had to be ended. And that was one of the factors that ended the American combat involvement. Government officials hate that. They really do. They do think that the public should stay out of foreign policy. The phrase that they use is politics stops at the water's edge. Mm-hmm. It's fine to have the public involved in things like debates over abortion rights or tax policy, but foreign policy should be left to a certain secretive elite. And that didn't happen in Vietnam. I suspect now is going to be another time when the public will rear its ugly head. Generally speaking, I think the American public and the European public are not that enthusiastic about war because I think there's an instinctive recognition of a trade-off between guns and butter. The more you spend on guns, the less you spend on butter. And the Ukraine, this has been dramatic because the sanctions that have been used have probably done more damage to the economies of the United States and especially Europe, especially Germany, than it has to Russia. And so enormous price has been paid in terms of living standards and will be paid in the future by the public of the United States and Europe. Germany's being deindustrialized by this. It's quite remarkable how much they're putting up with this policy that's hurting them so much. And I wonder how much the public is going to stand for this. I mean, government officials, top leaders throughout Europe, have some of the lowest popularity ratings ever seen. I mean, what is it? Schultz, I think, is under 20%, if I'm not mistaken. Macron is under 20%. Keir Starmer just started, and he's deeply unpopular. Trudeau had to resign. So I think there's an enormous crisis of confidence. In Vietnam, it was called the credibility gap. I think we're getting a credibility gap here now not only between the public and the leadership, not just the nominal leaders, but also the foreign policy establishments on both sides of the Atlantic. And I think you could get increasingly a revolt by the public against continued intervention. At least I don't believe in wishful thinking. I kind of gave up on that. It's not worth the time. Maybe I'm engaging wishful thinking here. I don't know. But I can see that as a plausible scenario, where the public simply refuses to accept this kind of permanent war, which is the agenda here. That's the neocon agenda, some form of permanent war. I mean, they're almost all openly talking about that in Ukraine. They want a temporary ceasefire, then allow Ukraine to rearm and re-equip, and they'll keep confronting Russia almost indefinitely. And so I think that's the agenda. This is not going to be very good for living standards in Europe and the United States. People complain, and rightly, about the rise of the AfD in Germany, which is not a very savory party, and I certainly don't look forward to its rise. But it's rising partly because of the Ukraine war and the damage Ukraine has done to the social fabric of Germany. And if the establishment of Germany does not like the AfD, and they shouldn't like it, they should recognize that their policies are fueling this party. They're making it possible. Same thing with the National Front and the National Rally in France. Donald Trump is partly, I think, the product of the fact that the American public sees the Democratic Party, sees people like Hillary Clinton, Joseph Biden, and Harris as too interventionist. And they suspect, I don't know if this is true, and I guess we'll find out. They suspect that Donald Trump will be less interventionist. And so I think this is having a very destabilizing effect on the political atmosphere on both sides of the Atlantic, and that's a very heavy price we'll pay.
No.
But nevertheless, I think the silver lining may be, at some point, the public may put its foot down and may insist that we adopt a less warlike policy, one that's more compatible with the public interest and high living standards.
No, absolutely. I mean, that would be the wish. But in the meantime, the matter of the fact remains that neoconservative ideology is deeply ingrained in the foreign policy establishment of the United States in both parties, and it has been largely been massaged into the Europeans as well, especially on the EU level, on the NATO level. I mean, it is omnipresent, I would say. Like, even though not everybody agrees on the details, but this idea of confronting the enemy, right? The enemy, and confronting the Russians, confronting the Iranians and the North Koreans, and now the Chinese. The big difference in the new Trump administration is that the anti-Russian neocons were exchanged now for anti-Chinese neocons. Now, the question remains: how should the other actors in the international sphere deal with that? I mean, one thing is you can militarize yourself, but that will only feed into their narrative, and you can be confrontative yourself, but that will only help the neocons, right? You ping pong the ball back and forth, and you escalate. What would be a smart foreign policy approach to kind of take the wind out of the sails of these neocons in the US and Europe? Do you have any kind of strategic advice to diplomats?
I mean, I suppose the idea would be building up a domestic base that contests this, because it seems to me the major parties in the major countries in Europe there's no difference between the Social Democrats in Germany and the Christian Democrats, or very little. There's no difference in Britain between Labour and Conservatives. Keir Starmer is doing exactly what his Conservative predecessors did. And so I can't imagine, basically, if the Socialist Party ever comes back to power in France, that would be any different from what Macron's doing, at least in the near term. And so I don't really see the existing major parties to be the answer. I mean, in Germany, you are seeing Sarah Wagenknecht, who is taking a kind of more traditionally left-wing anti-war position. She's trying to revive the idea of an anti-war left that is populist rather than mired in identity politics. And, you know, I don't agree with everything she says, but I wish her well. And I wish her well in the endeavor. So I would see the hope coming from the public getting fed up. Generally speaking, I think that it's a good thing that you're getting an alternative to American power in the world. Countries like Cuba, which have been suffering for decades under American sanctions at enormous cost to their populations and no benefit to anybody, will have other countries they can deal with. Countries who are bullied by the United States to either adopt a position or have the United States adopt regime change. They can perhaps get protection from countries in the BRICS. And so I see a multipolar world as a very positive development. And that clearly is where we're going at a global level. As I would see it, one of the main motives in starting the war in Ukraine, and I see it very much as something that was openly provoked by the United States and NATO. Question is, why did they provoke it? What was their strategy? I think their strategy was to destroy Russia with sanctions, to turn the ruble into rubble, as President Biden colorfully put it, to knock Russia out of the leagues of the great powers, possibly break it up into mini states. That was openly being discussed in Washington.
Yes.
I mean, imagine if Russia were to discuss breaking up the United States or Europe, but leave that aside. We were discussing that as a possible policy objective, and to fire, so to speak, a shot across the bow to the Chinese, that if you confront us, this is what we can do to you. And through victory, to establish the United States as the only pole of power to which countries must gravitate. There's the bandwagon effect in international relations. People bandwagon with the winner. If the US could win the war, and we fully expect we could through sanctions, countries would bandwagon with us, and there'd be no other contender in town. The Chinese would have to accept a secondary status in the world. Russia would become a vassal state of the United States, which is what we wanted them to be, and all would be well. Obviously, the policy of doing this has unraveled and has, so to speak, blown up in our faces.
Yep. Yep. But it has huge potential to wreak even more havoc, right?
Well, there's nuclear war. There's always that possibility. I wouldn't rule that out.
A what war?
Nuclear war.
Yes.
There's always that possibility.
Maybe a very last point on the humanitarian intervention side. Do you have an advice to people who oppose humanitarian intervention, who are then like usually confronted with, oh, but you want so many people to die, you don't want to protect people? What's the best way to respond to that argument?
Well, have a look at Iraq. The whole thing that argument was made. Are you supporting Saddam Hussein? Why are you opposing the overthrow of Saddam Hussein? I mean, do you want him to torture people to death? Do you want him to torture children in front of their parents as he's done? Do you want him to use poison gas? Is that what you're saying? Well, so we overthrew him, and even more people died as a result. The result was worse from a humanitarian standpoint, obviously worse. And we also wasted trillions of dollars that could have, imagine what kind of wonderful humanitarian projects we could have done with, what was it, $5 trillion, I believe is the current figure, if I'm not mistaken. $5 trillion, it's more than the gross domestic product of Great Britain. It was all wasted on nothing that killed, except killing a million innocent people that didn't have to die. So that's the legacy of humanitarian intervention in Iraq. You want another Iraq? Then go ahead, back a humanitarian intervention in the future. You want another Ukraine, where hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have died and we'll lose the war anyway. That's the legacy of humanitarian intervention. People tend to forget that war is a terrible way to promote human rights. The bottom line is, when you have a humanitarian crisis, the most important thing is don't make it worse. Oftentimes you can't make it better. What you should remember is the medical advice: first, do no harm. That's why I named my book that. Don't make it worse. And invariably, or almost invariably, military action has made it worse.
Very wise words. David Gibbs, people who want to read more from you, on which platform do you publish? Do you publish on a regular basis?
Yes, I do. I have a website. I'm not really into social media and that kind of thing, but I have a website where I put my publications. It's called dgibbs, D-G-I-B-B-S, .arizona.edu.
Everybody go to David Gibbs's homepage to find more of his writings. He produces wonderful analysis and wonderful talks, as you can hear here. David Gibbs, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.